June 6, 1944, 6:30 a.m. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was underway, but from behind the concrete walls of strongpoint WN-62 overlooking Omaha Beach, one German soldier was about to become both a legend and a nightmare. 21-year-old Heinrich Severloh gripped his MG-42 machine gun, watching through the morning mist as thousands of American landing craft approached the beach below. In his hands was a weapon capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute, fast enough that veterans would later say it sounded like ripping canvas. For the next 9 hours, this young farm boy from Lower Saxony would fire over 13,500 rounds at the brave American soldiers storming ashore. Heinrich would later claim he killed or wounded over 2,000 Americans that day, a figure historians debate, a claim that helped cement his post-war nickname, the Beast of Omaha Beach. But this is not just a story about one of the bloodiest days in American military history. This is about what happened decades later, when Heinrich Severloh came face to face with the American survivors of his deadly marksmanship. What those veterans did when they met the man who had killed so many of their brothers will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the true meaning of honor. Stay with me, because this story proves that sometimes the greatest victories happen not on the battlefield, but in the human heart decades later. But before we dive into this extraordinary tale of forgiveness, hit that subscribe button. We're uncovering untold stories of World War II prisoners and survivors that you won't find in any history book. To understand the extraordinary reconciliation that would come later, we must first understand Heinrich Severloh and the hell he created on June 6, 1944. Heinrich was born in 1923 in the small farming village of Metzingen in Lower Saxony, Germany. Like so many young Germans of his generation, he was swept up in the machinery of Nazi conscription before he was old enough to understand the true horror of the war he was about to join. By 1943, at just 20 years old, he found himself assigned to the 352 Infantry Division, stationed along Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall was Nazi Germany's massive coastal defense system, stretching from Norway to France, designed to repel any Allied invasion. Heinrich's unit was positioned at Widerstands Nest 62, Resistance Nest 62, a heavily fortified strongpoint perched on the bluffs overlooking what the Allies had codenamed Omaha Beach. WN-62 was a fortress of reinforced concrete, bristling with machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons. WN-62 overlooked the Easy Red and Fox Green sectors near Colleville-sur-Mer. From its position 100 feet above the beach, it commanded a perfect field of fire over the entire landing zone. Heinrich's position was equipped with an MG-42 machine gun, the most feared weapon in the German arsenal. American GIs called it Hitler's buzzsaw because of its incredibly high rate of fire. But Heinrich Severloh was more than just another German conscript manning a machine gun. Within his unit, he was considered a skilled Scharfschütze, a marksman with strong shooting ability. While not a trained sniper, his years of farm hunting had given him steady hands and a keen eye that would make him devastatingly effective with both machine gun and rifle. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, Heinrich peered through his gun sights at a sight that would have terrified even veteran soldiers. The largest armada in human history approaching his section of beach. Roughly 7,000 ships supported the landings, with about 156,000 to 160,000 Allied troops in the assault on Hitler's Fortress Europe. The first American landing craft hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 a.m. What happened next would become one of the bloodiest chapters in military history, and Heinrich Severloh would be at the center of it all. But he had no idea that decades later, he'd be shaking hands with the very men he was about to fire upon. From his concrete bunker, Heinrich Severloh had a perfect view of the American tragedy unfolding below. The Allied planners had made critical miscalculations about Omaha Beach. They expected to face a weak, demoralized garrison of older German soldiers and foreign conscripts. Instead, they ran headlong into the 352 Infantry Division, battle-hardened veterans who had been reinforced just days before the invasion. As the first wave of American soldiers waded through the surf, Heinrich opened fire with his MG-42, the weapon's distinctive sound, a rapid-fire buzz that could fire 20 rounds in the time it took a soldier to take 2 steps, echoed across the beach. American veterans would later say that the MG-42's rate of fire was so fast that individual shots were impossible to distinguish. It created one continuous, terrifying roar. From his elevated position, Heinrich could see everything with crystal clarity. American soldiers, weighed down by equipment and soaked by the cold English Channel, struggled through the surf only to be cut down by his methodical fire. The beach, which should have been taken in hours according to Allied plans, became a killing field. By day's end, about 2,400 US casualties were sustained at Omaha, killed, wounded, or missing. How many were due to Severloh is unknowable. He later claimed more than 2,000, a figure most historians consider implausible. Heinrich fired with the precision of a trained marksman and the desperation of a soldier who knew that failure meant the end of his homeland. He would later claim that he personally fired over 13,500 rounds that day. That's enough ammunition to fill a bathtub, enough bullets to arm an entire company of soldiers. Between machine gun bursts, Heinrich also used his rifle to pick off individual targets with marksman-level precision. American officers, radio operators, medics, anyone who seemed to be in a position of leadership became a priority target. His shooting was so accurate that American survivors would later say they could hear the distinctive crack of his rifle even over the chaos of battle. For 9 hours, Heinrich Severloh held his position as wave after wave of American soldiers attempted to cross the beach. Bodies piled up in the surf. The water turned red with blood. Landing craft burned on the shoreline. American soldiers took shelter behind steel obstacles, and the bodies of their fallen comrades, pinned down by the devastating fire from WN-62 and other German positions. But Heinrich was not just a mindless killing machine. Years later, he would describe the psychological toll of watching so many young Americans die under his guns. "I could see their faces through my sights," he would recall. "They were boys just like me. Boys who wanted to go home to their mothers and sweethearts just like me." As the day progressed, American determination and superior numbers began to tell. Individual soldiers and small units found ways to advance up the bluffs, using every shell crater and piece of debris as cover. By late afternoon, American forces had begun to flank the German strongpoints, forcing Heinrich and his comrades to abandon their positions. The retreat was chaotic and desperate. Heinrich carried his wounded commander on his back as they fled inland, leaving behind the concrete fortress that had served as his personal killing ground. Behind them, Omaha Beach was finally in American hands, but at a cost that would haunt both sides for decades to come. Heinrich Severloh had survived D-Day, but his war was far from over. And unknown to him, his reputation as the Beast of Omaha Beach was just beginning to spread through American units, creating a legend that would follow him for the rest of his life. The weeks following D-Day were a blur of retreat for Heinrich Severloh and the remnants of the German army in Normandy. The massive Allied buildup that followed the successful invasion had turned the tide of war decisively against Germany. Heinrich's unit was pushed steadily inland, fighting desperate delaying actions as American, British and Canadian forces expanded their beachhead. After WN-62 fell, Severloh retreated and surrendered near Colville-sur-Mer shortly after D-Day. He was sent as a POW to the United States, Boston. In December 1946, he was transferred to Britain for labor duty and returned to Germany in March. In 1947, the irony was not lost on him. He was now a prisoner of the same American army he had fought so effectively just days earlier. American intelligence officers who interrogated Heinrich were initially unaware that they had captured one of the most effective German defenders of D-Day. To them, he was just another young German soldier among the thousands being processed through prisoner of war camps. Heinrich himself said nothing about his role at WN-62, partly out of fear of retaliation, but mostly out of a growing sense of shame about what he had done. Like hundreds of thousands of other German prisoners, Heinrich was shipped across the Atlantic to prisoner of war camps in the United States. He spent the remainder of the war in various camps, working on American farms and learning English. The treatment he received from his American captors was, by his own account, fair and humane, a sharp contrast to what he had expected based on Nazi propaganda. During his captivity, Heinrich had time to reflect on what he had witnessed and done on June 6, 1944. The propaganda that had sustained him as a soldier began to crumble as he learned more about the true nature of the Nazi regime and the war crimes committed in Germany's name. He began to understand that the Americans he had killed were not the monsters described in German propaganda, but young men fighting for principles of freedom and democracy. After the war ended, Heinrich was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He returned to Lower Saxony, to the same farming village where he had grown up, but he was no longer the innocent farm boy who had left 3 years earlier. The weight of what he had done at Omaha Beach settled on him like a shroud that would never lift. For the next 2 decades, Heinrich Severloh lived a quiet life as a farmer and postal worker. He married, raised children, and became a pillar of his small community. But he remained largely silent about the war, even to his family. The memories of D-Day were locked away in a part of his mind that he shared with no one. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially secrets about one of the most documented battles in history. In the 1980s, as D-Day approached its 40th anniversary, military historians began intensive research into the German defense of Omaha Beach. They interviewed survivors, examined captured German records, and pieced together the story of individual strongpoints. It was during this research that Heinrich Severloh's name first began to appear in historical documents. Records from the 352 Infantry Division, combined with testimony from other German survivors, identified him as the machine gunner at WN62, who had been responsible for much of the carnage on Omaha Beach. In the 1960s, 2 decades after the war, Heinrich received an unexpected letter from across the Atlantic. A D-Day veteran named David Silver, who had been wounded during the assault on Omaha Beach, had found Heinrich's name in the best-selling book The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan. Silver had written to Heinrich through the book's publisher, seeking to understand what had happened on that terrible day. This first contact between former enemies marked the beginning of an extraordinary correspondence that would transform both men's lives. Heinrich's initial reaction was shock and fear. He had spent 20 years trying to forget June 6, 1944, and suddenly an American soldier who had been there was reaching out to him. But Silver's letter was not filled with anger or accusation. Instead, it was a simple human plea for understanding from one veteran to another. The correspondence continued for years. Heinrich and Silver exchanged letters, photographs, and memories, building a relationship through written words before they ever met face to face. Silver shared what he had experienced on the beach, while Heinrich gradually opened up about what he had seen from the bluffs. Through these letters, both men began to heal wounds they didn't even know they carried. Silver had spent decades wondering about the Germans who had made the landing so costly. Heinrich had carried guilt and shame about the Americans he had killed. Their correspondence provided both with a human face to put on their former enemies. Researchers and veterans groups amplified his story in the 1980s to 1990s, leading to prominent anniversary meetings with US veterans in Normandy. Heinrich's initial reaction was to refuse. He had spent 4 decades trying to forget June 6, 1944, and he had no desire to relive those memories publicly. But the historian was persistent and eventually convinced Heinrich that sharing his story could contribute to historical understanding of one of the most important battles of the 20th century. The process of breaking his decades-long silence was agonizing for Heinrich. As he described his memories of D-Day, the full weight of what he had done came flooding back. He remembered specific faces of American soldiers he had killed. He recalled the sound of wounded men calling for their mothers in the surf below his position. He described the mechanical precision with which he had operated his machine gun, treating human targets like clay pigeons in a shooting gallery. But something unexpected happened during these interviews. As Heinrich talked about D-Day, he began to experience a form of catharsis he had never imagined possible. For 4 decades he had carried his burden alone. Now, for the first time, he was able to express the guilt, shame, and remorse that had haunted him since the war. The historian's book was published in Germany in 1985, and Heinrich's story began to attract international attention. American D-Day researchers, who had spent years trying to understand why Omaha Beach had been such a bloodbath, suddenly had a detailed first-person account from one of the German defenders who had made it so costly. But the real breakthrough came in 1989, when Heinrich decided to take a step that required enormous courage. He agreed to travel to Normandy for the 45th anniversary of D-Day. It would be his first return to the battlefield since his retreat in 1944, and his first face-to-face encounter with American D-Day veterans. The trip was organized by a German veterans organization that was working to promote reconciliation between former enemies. Heinrich was nervous about how American veterans would react to meeting a man who had killed so many of their comrades. He half expected anger, hatred, or even violence. What he found instead would restore his faith in human nature and teach him that forgiveness is possible even after the most terrible acts of war. June 6, 1989, 45 years to the day after D-Day, Heinrich Severloh stood on the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach, looking down at the same stretch of sand where he had created such carnage in 1944. The concrete bunker of WN62 was still there, now preserved as a historical monument, but the machine gun ports that had once spat death were empty and silent. Heinrich was part of a small group of German D-Day veterans who had come to Normandy for the anniversary commemoration. Also present were hundreds of American, British, and Canadian veterans who had returned to honor their fallen comrades and mark one of the most significant days in modern history. The meeting between former enemies had been carefully arranged by historians and veterans organizations on both sides. There was understandable tension. Many of the American veterans had lost close friends on Omaha Beach, and the idea of meeting the Germans who had killed them was emotionally difficult. But what happened next surprised everyone, including Heinrich himself. The first American veteran to approach Heinrich was David Silver, the man who had been corresponding with him for years but whom he had never met in person. Silver had landed on Omaha Beach as a 19-year-old private with the 1st Infantry Division. He had been wounded during the assault and had carried shrapnel in his leg for 45 years as a reminder of that terrible day. Heinrich expected their face-to-face meeting to be awkward or emotional. Instead, Silver extended his hand and said, "You were just a soldier doing your duty, same as me. I'm glad we both survived." The simple humanity of that gesture broke something loose in Heinrich that had been frozen for 45 years. Tears streamed down his face as he shook hands with a man whose friends he had almost certainly killed. But Silver's acceptance opened the door for other American veterans to approach Heinrich, and what followed was one of the most remarkable scenes of reconciliation in military history. One by one, American D-Day veterans came forward to meet the German machine gunner who had made their landing so costly. Instead of hatred, they offered understanding. Instead of blame, they expressed a soldier's recognition that Heinrich had been doing his job under impossible circumstances, just as they had been doing theirs. Harold Baumgarten, who had landed on Omaha Beach with the 116th Infantry Regiment and had been severely wounded, told Heinrich, "We were all kids who got caught up in something bigger than ourselves. You didn't start that war any more than I did." Other American veterans also came forward, telling Heinrich that they too had carried anger for decades, but were ready to let it go. As one veteran put it, "We were enemies then, but we don't have to be enemies now." The conversations continued throughout the day. American veterans shared their memories of the landing, describing what they had experienced from the beach, while Heinrich described what he had seen from the bluffs. For the first time, both sides were able to understand D-Day from their former enemy's perspective. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Heinrich was introduced to a group of widows whose husbands had been killed on Omaha Beach. He had dreaded this meeting most of all, expecting these women to hold him directly responsible for their decades of loss and grief. Instead, as recalled by participants and later writers, one widow, whose husband had been killed in the first wave, told him, "My husband died fighting for freedom. You were fighting for your country. We were on different sides, but we were both fighting for what we believed in. I don't hate you for that." Think about that for a moment. A woman who had spent 45 years as a widow because of this man's marksmanship, offering forgiveness instead of hatred. What began as a carefully orchestrated historical meeting evolved into something far more profound: genuine friendships between former enemies. Heinrich Severloh discovered that American D-Day veterans were not the faceless enemies he had fired at through his machine gun sights, but individuals with stories, families, hopes, and fears just like his own. In the months following that first meeting in Normandy, Heinrich began corresponding with several American veterans. They exchanged letters, photographs, and memories, building relationships that transcended the terrible events of June 6, 1944. David Silver, the first veteran to shake Heinrich's hand, became particularly close to the German machine gunner. They discovered they had much in common beyond their shared experience of D-Day. Both had grown up on farms, both had been reluctant soldiers, and both had spent decades haunted by memories of the war. Silver invited Heinrich to visit him in the United States, an offer that Heinrich accepted with nervous excitement. In 1991, 47 years after shooting at Americans on Omaha Beach, Heinrich Severloh stepped off an airplane in New York as a welcomed guest of the country he had once fought against. The visit was a revelation for Heinrich. He traveled across America, meeting D-Day veterans and their families in their homes, seeing the country that these men had been fighting to protect. He visited small towns and big cities, attended veterans' reunions, and spoke at schools and historical societies about his experiences. At each stop, Heinrich was amazed by the reception he received. Instead of hatred or resentment, Americans showed him curiosity, respect, and often genuine warmth. Children asked him questions about the war, treating him like a living piece of history rather than a former enemy. Their grandparents, some of whom had fought in the Pacific or European theaters, welcomed him as a fellow veteran who had served his country under different circumstances. Harold Baumgarten, The American veteran who had been severely wounded on Omaha Beach became another close friend. Baumgarten had lost his left eye and suffered multiple wounds during the landing, injuries that had affected him for the rest of his life. Yet he harbored no bitterness toward Heinrich, and the two men developed a friendship based on their shared understanding of war's costs. Heinrich and I were both victims of that war, Baumgarten would later say. He didn't choose to be there any more than I did. We were both just young men caught up in events beyond our control. Perhaps most remarkably, Heinrich also developed friendships with some of the D-Day widows he had met in Normandy. These women, who had lost their husbands to his marksmanship, treated him with a grace and forgiveness that he found almost incomprehensible. As recalled by participants and later writers, one widow, whose husband had been killed in the first wave at Omaha Beach, invited Heinrich to visit her home. She showed him photographs of her husband, talked about their brief marriage and the son who had grown up without a father. Instead of blame, she offered understanding. "My husband knew he might die when he went to Normandy," she told Heinrich. "He was fighting for principles he believed in. You were doing the same thing, just from the other side. Hating you won't bring him back, but forgiving you helps me find peace." As Heinrich Severloh continued to meet with American D-Day veterans throughout the 1990s, something extraordinary began to happen. The friendships he formed with former enemies began to heal wounds that had festered for decades on both sides. For the American veterans, meeting Heinrich provided closure and understanding they had never expected to find. Many had spent 50 years wondering about the German soldiers who had made their landing so costly. Meeting Heinrich in person, seeing him as a man rather than an enemy, helped them process trauma they had carried since the war. David Silver later said, "For 50 years, I wondered about the Germans who were shooting at us that day. Were they monsters? Were they fanatics? Meeting Heinrich showed me they were just soldiers like us, doing their duty under terrible circumstances. That understanding helped me make peace with D-Day in a way I never thought possible." For Heinrich, the acceptance and forgiveness he received from American veterans lifted a burden he had carried since 1944. The guilt and shame that had haunted him for decades began to transform into something more constructive, a commitment to ensuring that future generations understood the true costs of war. Heinrich became a regular speaker at schools, museums, and historical conferences, sharing his story not to glorify war but to illustrate its human cost. He would describe the mechanical precision with which he had operated his machine gun, but he would also talk about the faces he remembered, the nightmares that had followed, and the decades of guilt he had endured. "I want young people to understand that war is not a video game or a movie," he would tell audiences. "Every shot I fired on D-Day killed or wounded a real person. Someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. The Americans I killed were not my enemies as human beings. They were just on the other side of a conflict that none of us had started." His message resonated particularly strongly with German audiences, who were still grappling with their country's role in World War II. Heinrich represented a different kind of German war story, not the narrative of Nazi ideology, but the experience of ordinary soldiers who had been caught up in events beyond their control. American veterans who had befriended Heinrich became some of his strongest supporters in this educational mission. They would appear with him at speaking events, providing the American perspective on D-Day, while Heinrich shared the German side. Together, they presented a complete picture of the battle that was far more nuanced and human than traditional military histories. Harold Baumgarten, despite his severe D-Day wounds, traveled with Heinrich to Germany to speak at schools there. American and German students would listen, amazed, as former enemies discussed their shared experience of that terrible day. "The most important thing Heinrich and I can teach," Baumgarten would say, "is that the soldiers on both sides of D-Day were human beings. We weren't heroes or monsters. We were young men doing our duty as we understood it. War is hell, but peace is possible if we choose to see our former enemies as people, rather than symbols." Heinrich Severloh's transformation from the Beast of Omaha Beach to an ambassador of reconciliation became one of the most powerful examples of healing between former enemies in the post-war era. His friendships with American D-Day veterans demonstrated that even the most bitter conflicts can be overcome through understanding, forgiveness, and shared humanity. The annual D-Day commemorations in Normandy became a regular gathering point for Heinrich and his American veteran friends. Each June 6th, they would meet on the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach, former enemies now united in their commitment to honor the dead and educate the living about war's costs. These gatherings attracted international media attention, and Heinrich's story became a symbol of post-war reconciliation between Germany and its former enemies. Documentaries, books, and articles featured his remarkable journey from deadly machine gunner to peace advocate. But perhaps the most significant impact of Heinrich's story was on the families of D-Day casualties. Many relatives of soldiers killed on Omaha Beach sought him out, not for revenge or confrontation, but for closure and understanding. Meeting the man who had been responsible for their loved one's death often provided a form of healing they had never expected. One brother, whose sibling had been killed in the first wave at Omaha Beach, traveled to Germany to meet Heinrich in 2004, 60 years after D-Day. "I spent 60 years hating the faceless Germans who killed my brother," he said. "Meeting Heinrich showed me that hate was destroying me, not them. He didn't choose to be there any more than my brother did. They were both just doing their duty." Heinrich's American veteran friends also helped him connect with historical researchers who were working to preserve D-Day memories for future generations. He contributed to numerous oral history projects, ensuring that the German perspective on the battle would be preserved alongside American accounts. As Heinrich aged, his American veteran friends became his closest companions. They understood him in ways that even his German neighbors could not, because they shared the unique bond of men who had survived one of history's most intense battles. Despite having been on opposite sides, they had more in common with each other than with civilians who had never experienced combat. David Silver summed up this unusual friendship. "Heinrich and I were trying to kill each other on June 6, 1944, but we were also the only ones who truly understood what the other went through that day. War made us enemies, but survival made us brothers." Heinrich Severloh spent his final years as a living reminder that redemption is possible even after the most terrible acts of war. He continued speaking at schools and historical events well into his 80s, always accompanied by American veteran friends who vouched for his transformation from feared enemy to peace advocate. His message never wavered. War brings out both the worst and the best in human nature, but peace requires a conscious choice to see former enemies as fellow human beings. He would often end his talks by reading the names of American soldiers who had been killed on Omaha Beach, honoring the men whose deaths had haunted him for decades. In his final interview, given just months before his death in 2006, Heinrich reflected on his extraordinary journey from machine gunner to peacemaker. "I cannot change what I did on June 6, 1944. I cannot bring back the American boys I killed, but I can use the rest of my life to ensure that people remember them not as statistics, but as human beings who died for principles they believed in." Heinrich Severloh died peacefully on January 14, 2006, at age 82. His funeral in Lower Saxony was attended by several American D-Day veterans who had traveled to Germany to honor their former enemy, who had become their friend. David Silver delivered a eulogy that captured the remarkable transformation they had all witnessed. "Heinrich Severloh was once my enemy, but he became my brother. He showed me that even the darkest chapters of history can be redeemed through courage, honesty, and the willingness to seek forgiveness. The young German soldier who fired at us from those cliffs became an old German man who taught us about peace." The story of Heinrich Severloh and his American veteran friends offers hope. In an age when old conflicts seem impossible to heal and new ones continue to emerge, their remarkable reconciliation proves that even the most bitter enemies can become friends if they have the courage to see each other as human beings rather than symbols. Heinrich's transformation from the Beast of Omaha Beach to an ambassador of peace demonstrates that individuals can choose redemption even after committing terrible acts in war. His willingness to face his past honestly, combined with the extraordinary forgiveness shown by American veterans, created a healing that benefited both sides. The friendships between Heinrich and his American veteran companions lasted until death separated them. They had discovered that shared experience of battle, even as enemies, created bonds that transcended nationality, ideology, and even the memory of violence. They had learned that understanding does not require agreement, and that forgiveness does not require forgetting. Their legacy continues through the educational programs they established, and the countless people who were moved by their example. Schools, museums, and peace organizations around the world use their story to teach that reconciliation is possible if people choose courage over hatred, understanding over ignorance, and humanity over ideology. Heinrich Severloh's remarkable journey from feared enemy to beloved friend reminds us that redemption is always possible. Forgiveness can heal the deepest wounds, and former enemies can become the strongest advocates for peace. In a world still torn by conflict, their example lights the way toward a more hopeful future. The young German farm boy, who became a deadly machine gunner, learned that the greatest victory is not achieved through superior firepower, but through the moral courage to seek forgiveness and the wisdom to offer it in return. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of forgiveness, and subscribe for more incredible stories from the greatest generation.